This is the video lecture for Lesson 13 in Clayton Croy's A Primer to Biblical Greek. In this lesson, we will discuss the aorist tense and the first aorist active and middle forms of the indicative verb. Remember, we talked a little bit about principal parts, which are those basic forms of a verb from which all other forms can be made. And in Greek, you'll recall there are 6 principal parts, and we have already learned 2 of them, the present active indicative and the future active indicative. And in this lesson, we will learn about the aorist active indicative, which is the 3rd principal part. What is the aorist tense? Let's provide a brief introduction to the aorist tense. So the aorist tense is formed off of the 3rd and the 6th principal parts, as I just mentioned. It is a secondary tense. That means it refers to actions in past time, similar to the imperfect tense. Unlike the imperfect tense, however, it signifies action that is occurring in past time that is simple or undefined. Remember that with the imperfect tense, the aspect of the imperfect tense had the continuous notion rather than simple or undefined. Like the imperfect, the aorist tense takes an augment. And finally, the aorist can be grouped into 2 basic forms, the first and second aorist. This lecture is about the first aorist. The next lecture will be about the second aorist. Here are the first aorist forms. You can see I've tried to reproduce this chart with the typical color coding that you've become used to. The stem there in the light blue, the personal endings in salmon, and the augment in brown. And you'll also see that the sigma alpha pretty much consistently through the chart has been marked as well. This is the marker of the first aorist. So, elusa, I loosed, elusas, you singular, loosed, elusen, he, she, or it, loosened, elusamen, we loosened, elusate, you all loosened, elusan, they loosened. And here is the aorist active infinitive, loosai. Please note that there is no augment with the infinitive, as the augment only occurs in the indicative mood. And since the infinitive is not a part of the indicative mood, it does not have the augment. With that chart still up on our screen, let's make a few comments about the first aorist active indicative. To begin with, you can see that we've added the augment before the stem. And so some of those augment rules that we learned in previous lectures on the imperfect would also be true of the aorist as well. From there, you add the sigma alpha after the stem. Once again, rules for changes that you saw with the future when you added the sigma with the future are going to be similar in the aorist. And the only form that does not have the sigma alpha is that 3rd singular. Then you add the secondary endings, which are the endings that we saw in the imperfect active indicative. The only exception to this is the first singular. So again, elusa, elusas, elusen, elusamen, elusate, elusan. You really want to be keeping an eye out for that sigma alpha. That is what will signal that you are in a first aorist form. Here is the chart for the first aorist middle indicative. Again, as I've done in past slides, this one provides the breakdown of the stem and the personal endings, the augment, and then the sigma alpha. So, elusamen, I loosened for myself. Eluso, you singular loosened for yourself. Elusato, he, she, or it loosened for himself, herself, or itself. Elusametha, we loosened for ourselves. Elusaste, you all loosened for yourselves. Elusanto, they loosened for themselves. And here is the first aorist middle infinitive. Again, there is no augment with the infinitive, loosasthai. And the sthai ending is what we have seen in the past with the middle passive infinitive. Once again, just a few notes about the first aorist middle indicative. Once again, we see the addition of the augment before the stem. We've added the sigma alpha after the stem in all forms but the second singular. And then we add endings from the present middle passive indicative that we've seen. And the second singular form is a bit weird. I would recommend that you begin to recognize it as such. You'll want to distinguish it from the future active indicative first singular, which would also have the sigma omega, but the augment here indicates that you are in the aorist tense. If you need an explanation for why the second singular first aorist middle indicative appears this way, Croy provides an explanation from the history of the Greek language. So let's get started with an example from the practice and review. Tote ha didaskalas apeluse tan aklan kai hupestrepsen estan oikan autu. As we've done in previous exercises, I recommend that you begin by bracketing off prepositions and genitive phrases. In this case, we have the prepositional phrase at the end, eis tan oikan, and then autu is a genitive personal pronoun of him. And from there, we'll identify the verbs. And in this case, we have two verbs. First, apeluse, and you can see I've broken it up, apeluse, and this is one of our compound verbs with the preposition apo in front of it, and so it's from apoluo. And so based on this breakdown, you see the augment and the sigma, no sigma alpha because it's third singular. We would parse this as first aorist active indicative, third singular from apoluo. And then the next verb is hupestrepsen. Again, this is a compound verb. It's from the verb hupostrepho. And so as I've broken it out for you, you can see the preposition in front, hup, and then the augment in front of the root or in front of the stem, streph. And then psen is, again, a third singular ending. And this is an example of when the addition of the sigma leads to a spelling change of the last letter of the stem. So we would parse this first aorist active indicative third singular from hupostrepho. Just as a note, it is not necessary for exams or quizzes to include first or second aorist. Recognizing it simply as an aorist will do. From this, you would find the subject and begin to look at the other parts of the sentence. So we only have one noun in the nominative case, ha didaskalas. So we would translate that as the subject. And then we see tan aklan as an accusative. It tells us the direct object of the verb apeluse. Who is sent away? Well, it's the crowd. And so from that information, we can make a guess at a good translation, which would be something like, then the teacher dismissed the crowd and returned to his house. And so eis tan oikan is accusative. It's accusative because it follows eis. And autu, as I mentioned earlier, is masculine singular genitive. It is modifying oikon. It tells us whose house it is. And its antecedent, the word that it's standing in for, is teacher, ha didaskalas. All right, that is the end of the lecture for lesson 13. Come back for lesson 14, where we will learn about the second aorist active and middle forms. Thank you for your attention.